Our last speaker of the morning is Alex.a.howe, who is getting an MS, working on an MS in forest ecology. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Darren, and thanks everyone for sticking around here right before lunch. So I'm going to be talking about results from my master's research I've been doing here at USC over the past couple years on seedling-based aspen restoration, and trying to hopefully convince you that despite some fact, that we've had some success and some failure with this project, that this is still a useful thing to be thinking about kind of as a supplementary tool for aspen management here in the West. So I know I'm talking to a room full of people who are probably quite familiar with aspen and its ecology here in the West, but I think it's important to start with just a quick recap and baseline. So we know that aspen, or the traditional view I should say on aspen, has been that it reproduces almost exclusively vegetatively via suckering. And that sexual reproduction is quite a rare event, almost to the point where it's really just not something that we manage for on the landscape on any sort of scale. Our clones are really large and old for the most part, and so we tend to do our management practices based around inducing as much overstory, or basically doing overstory treatments to induce as much root suckering as possible. So treatments like coppicing, thinning, or burning are the main ways we manage for aspen stands. And of course, if there's funding available, we'd like to fence it to protect that from herbivory. But it's important to think about these two forms of reproduction for aspen ecologically and what they mean for it over the long term. So when aspen reproduces predominantly via suckering, we get fewer and larger clones on the landscape, and that means less genetic diversity, because of course each clone is the same genetically, and that means less adaptive potential. Conversely, when we do have successful seeding events, we get more and smaller clones on the landscape. And that means higher levels of landscape genetic diversity and more adaptive potential. So why do we care about that? Well, of course, aspen's range climatically here in the West is predicted to shrink quite substantially over the coming century. And that's obviously not a novel idea. We expect that's going to be something that's going to challenge a lot of other important species as well going forward. But aspen may be more uniquely vulnerable to actually tracking that climate change successfully over the landscape because its dominant form of reproduction still is clonal, and seeding events are quite rare and may become even more rare in the future. So that really underscores the reason why we're interested in seedling-based aspen restoration kind of as a supplementary tool for our current management practices. So we can, of course, increase genetic diversity because every seedling we plant out is unique genetically. We can restore aspen where we've lost stands, which obviously we can't do with current practices, or we can establish it and bring it to new locations if we want to do more proactive management like assisted migration going forward. Of course, planting seedlings is not a novel concept in the world of forestry. We do it for a lot of other important species, but in the context of aspen in the West in particular, really no one's doing this on any sort of scale. There's really not been a lot of research into this specifically. So where this is being practiced, though, is in Alberta, Canada, where it's been used for oil sands mine reclamation work there. They've been using aspen kind of to kickstart the ecosystem after, of course, they're just completely strip mining the land and denuding it. And one of our project collaborators is Dr. Simon Landhauser at the University of Alberta, and he's really kind of led the research into developing the nursery protocols for producing high-quality aspen seedling stock, which, as he's found, are the metrics basically which predict a good quality aspen are quite different than they tend to be for other important conifer forestry species in particular. So our study objectives with this project have been fairly simple. Basically, this is really a pilot study to try and look at this here in the Intermountain West. And we want to basically bring those protocols that have already been developed for creating high-quality aspen seedling stock in Alberta and see if we can apply them to Intermountain West seed sources. And then we want to actually take those seedlings out and plant them in an environment we expect is likely to be more challenging here in the Intermountain West than some of the work they've done up in Canada, and do it without irrigation, of course, because that's not feasible on any sort of larger scale. So for this project, we're working in southwestern Utah in Cedar Mountain, which is basically right between Cedar City and Cedar Breaks National Monument. Lots of pure aspen stands are common up there. However, as you can see from these photos, a lot of them don't have a very healthy regenerating cohort in the understory. There's been a long history of sheep grazing there for the past 130 years or so. And this is all on private land that we're working through a state extension grant. So we're working directly with landowners on their land with this project. So we have seed coming from 3 major sources for this. First, up in Alberta, And these were seeds collected by Dr. Landhauser, who I mentioned before, and they're basically acting kind of as a point of comparison to our Intermountain West seed sources because they're ones that he worked with in developing the nursery protocols. And then our two Intermountain West seed sources, first coming just from up Logan Canyon here, collected by my advisor here, Dr. Karen Mock, and also seed coming from northern New Mexico near Los Alamos, collected by Dr. Owen Burney, who's at New Mexico State University, another project collaborator. So we took those seeds and cleaned them, and then we seeded out a total of 18,000 pots back in the spring of 2015. And as I mentioned before, the goal was to replicate that Alberta protocol, which kind of as its cornerstone has developing a very high root-to-shoot ratio in these seedlings, which has been linked to subsequent outplanting success for the aspen. And the most efficacious way that they've found to do that is to use a hormone treatment midsummer that basically causes an early bud set in the seedlings, but you continue to fertilize them throughout the rest of the growing season. And so the idea is they shut down their above-ground growth, stop producing new leaves and stem tissue, and rather sequester that into the root system, and basically able to nutrient load the root system as well through the continued fertilization. So we picked out 3 different sites on Cedar Mountain during that period, and they're not really too spatially far from each other. That's basically about 8 miles apart from site 1 to site 3. Put in 5 plots at each one of these sites, and we were basically picking these plots first and foremost, obviously, because we're working on private land, working with interested landowners for this project. We needed sites that were large enough that we could put in these plots next to each other and not be too close to existing aspen stands, because we didn't want to have suckering from them coming in inside of our plots, confusing with our actual seedlings. And we were picking plots that, given the relatively challenging conditions here on Cedar Mountain, would be as favorable as possible, at least we hoped, for the aspen. We constructed 8-foot wildlife exclosures around each of these plots to keep out, obviously, elk and deer and sheep. We did 2 rounds of herbicide application, and then we did a prescription burn right before we did our outplanting. And we did the actual planting once the seedlings were fully dormant that fall in 2015. Planted them out densely, 1 by 1 meter spacing for them, and all those 3 seed sources we put in equal in each of these plots so we could kind of compare them and how their performance was compared to one another. And we planted out a total of 7,200 seedlings across all 15 plots. So that was the study design. So let's now get into some results. So this is now looking at the nursery phase of this project. Again, under the same protocols, we were curious how our Intermountain West seed sources would fare as compared to our known Alberta source, what this was developed for. And you're looking at basically the root mass and shoot mass there on the left and center, and then just the ratio of those two, which I mentioned as kind of the key metric predicting a high-quality aspen seedling. And the kind of, the key part here was that we developed a significantly higher root-to-shoot ratio in the Alberta source than we did in either of our Intermountain West seed sources. And, that's interesting because, again, under the same protocols, the key difference here was that the Alberta source set bud as expected with that hormone treatment, but we saw much more mixed effects of a response to that treatment with the New Mexico and Utah sources. Some set bud, some then reflushed later in the summer, some didn't seem to respond to it or maybe just slowed down their growth. So that was a pretty important finding that we know we're going to have to do some tweaking with this protocol for whatever reason our sources down here are interacting differently. That also showed up in significantly higher concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus in the Alberta source as compared to our Intermountain West seed sources. So that's likely due to the fact, again, they shut down their leaf production. They weren't investing in expensive leaves, could instead sequester that into their root and stem tissue to take with them out into the field. All right, so now moving on to Cedar Mountain. So what we're looking at here is basically the final results after this last 2 years out in the field for how the seedlings actually fared. And so each one of these pie charts is one of the 15 plots separated by the 3 different sites here in the different panels. And obviously what you'll see is we lost a lot of our seedlings. Of course, we did have a couple good plots here at the 3rd site, and that's, I think, where the real story lies, and so I'm going to talk about those more here in just a second. But I think before that, I just want to briefly talk about the 2 main forms of mortality that we did see, because they're important to recognize. So pocket gophers were a big issue for us, especially during the first winter. They're active underneath the snowpack, and we tried to trap some of them out beforehand, but obviously we lost quite a few of them, especially at our 1st and 2nd sites. And so this is clearly something that would need to be considered when you're picking an appropriate place to do this, because they are quite susceptible to that herbivory. We think that there might be elevated populations on Cedar Mountain because they do a lot of predator control there, but we haven't formally tested that or anything like that. So still an important source of mortality in this study. The other big one was obviously drought related. And so, we're in a precipitation area that has monsoonal patterns that, basically late July, early August is when we get most of our precip. So basically post snowmelt in late spring, until that period, there's a long period where there's not a lot of precip, and these seedlings, obviously without a well-established root system, are kind of vulnerable to that soil dry down. And we saw quite a bit of that. And that's really driving the difference with what happened here and happened with these several plots where we saw some okay survival. Especially this one where we had about 75% survival, really good growth rates at this one. So, what made that one different? And what we realized after the first summer out there, after outplanting, was that we had this snowbank that was basically persistent on the landscape just upslope from that plot that was kind of draining into it and keeping it really saturated for a good part of the first part of the summer. And we didn't design our plot placement around that at all. We didn't see that when we were doing it the previous year because we were out there later in the summer. But it ended up being quite fortuitous because obviously we had our best plot out of that, and it gives some ideas that maybe in these really more marginal areas where you might want to do this, it's important to keep track of these kind of microsite factors like persistence, packs, snowpacks. And so thinking about that, I think, is going to be important going forward. So this graph is basically just showing the probability of seedling survival as a function of the early season, and this is from data from this year, from June and July average soil precipitation or percentage. And really what we're seeing here obviously makes sense. That what's really driving this change up here, there's a lot of noise around it, but those are the couple plots that we actually did see the survival at. They basically just had consistently higher soil moisture into that first part of the summer. So really just driving home the point that that's really a huge factor here for these aspen on these more marginal habitats. And of course, weather has a big part to play in restoration. So just looking back at June and July summer precip totals during this study, so 2016, you can see we had below average precip in both June and July compared to the 30-year averages here in green. Virtually nothing here this year, and it wasn't until July that we finally had above average. And obviously, this is a big factor that plays into restoration in general, is how the weather plays out, when you're actually doing these studies. And we can't directly control the weather, obviously. So I was interested, though, after seeing a lot of our mortality the first year, if there was something we could do to increase survival on the landscape. And so I set up this little small experiment in one of the plots where I lost all of my seedlings the first year, and basically just went to one of the stands right next to the plot, chipped up some downed aspen wood and branches, and basically did a simple mulching treatment inside the plot where I planted out 250 new seedlings, had half of them mulched, half of them unmulched, and then just compared how they did over this past summer. And the results were pretty striking. So of the 128 non-mulched, not a single one of them survived through the summer, versus the 128 mulched seedlings, we actually had 61% survival over this past year. So that was really driven by basically having twice as much retained summer soil moisture over the course of the whole summer. And so I'm not suggesting that a mulching treatment on a larger scale is necessarily the way to accomplish this, but I think it drives home the point that there are ways that we could increase survival through site prep and treatments, maybe just picking the right spots or planting underneath downwoody debris, places that are going to have more soil amelioration. There would be ways to accomplish this. Okay, so to kind of wrap up with some primary conclusions from this study. So we know from the nursery phase that there's going to have to be some work that needs to be done to refine our protocols, to regionally adapt them. Here in the Intermountain West, they react differently for whatever reason than boreal seed does. That being said, we were able to see significantly higher root-shoot ratios, we think, than in the absence of that hormone treatment based on some other data. So it does seem to be working, but it may be something that we're just going to need to tweak and refine going forward. And I didn't mention this data before, but we didn't actually see any survival differences between the three sources in the field portion of this, which is interesting because, of course, it suggests that the bottleneck is not seed source for establishment, it's really these limiting environmental conditions. And of course, over the longer term post-establishment, we would expect that there would be more differences that would play out in how adapted that seed source was to the local environment. And so doing more long-term research on that is going to be interesting to know how important it is to regionally source your seed for something like this. And then finally, aspen seedlings are clearly highly sensitive to summer soil moisture. And that's maybe not a surprise, but I think I was a little bit surprised just to see how intolerant they were to these drier conditions that we had out there these last 2 years. And it really drives home the point that doing appropriate site selection for this is going to be crucial, so you're not wasting your time and energy. And so doing more work to kind of figure out what those metrics are for picking the right locations to do this kind of work, especially in the more marginal habitats we often have in the Intermountain West here, is going to be crucial going forward. And I think one point I'd just like to mention really fast to wrap up here too is that we've been talking about fire a lot here, and I think one way you could think about aspen, seedling-based aspen restoration as being a useful tool is considering it as a potential for fire breaks, especially around important areas where we want to preserve wild and urban interface kind of areas. Aspen doesn't burn very well, and so establishing aspen in these locations could be a really useful way for basically kind of engineering our forests to have these kind of built-in fire breaks. So I think that's something that we are wanting to explore more going forward as well. And with that, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone who's helped out with this project and all the funding sources that have made it possible, and turn it over to questions if there's any time left. Okay.